What would you do if the man who saved your wife's life became the first person you tried to destroy, only because your fear arrived faster than the truth? By the time Nam's footsteps exploded through the hospital corridor, the day had already pushed too many hearts to the edge. His wife lay in a white room after a roadside accident. CEO Jack and Tu Tien, already carrying the weight of their own collapsing life, had brought her there instead of driving away. But hospitals are dangerous places for wounded minds. The smell of disinfectant, the cold lights, the sight of a stranger standing beside the bed, sometimes that is all it takes for panic to turn into accusation. And on that night, in a room that should have belonged only to recovery, gratitude was mistaken for guilt, kindness was mistaken for intrusion, and one violent misunderstanding threatened to drag all of them into a new disaster. Yet hidden inside that confrontation was a harder truth, one that none of them were ready to face. When life becomes cruel enough, even decent people can look directly at the hands saving them and still call those hands the enemy. The hospital hallway looked like a place where sound had gone to die. Everything was white, flat, and too clean. The walls reflected the cold neon light without mercy. Somewhere farther inside the ward, the mechanical beeping of medical machines rose and fell in a sterile rhythm, indifferent to human fear. The floor held the smell of disinfectant so sharply that it seemed to erase everything living. Even footsteps changed character there. They stopped sounding human and began sounding like warnings. Tu Tien stood just outside the room where the unconscious woman had been admitted. She had not moved far from the door since the emergency staff took the patient in. One hand still rested against the wall, as if her body needed something solid to hold her upright. She had lived through enough pain to recognize the shape of danger even before it fully arrived. And tonight, the danger was not blood, not physical injury, not the woman's breathing. It was misunderstanding, the kind that enters fast, speaks loudly, and leaves wounds harder to heal than broken bones. Jack stepped out of the room a few seconds later. He still carried himself with the same quiet restraint that had once made people instinctively respect him before they ever knew his name. His shirt sleeves were slightly disturbed now, his tie loosened just enough to show he had been moving, signing papers, paying initial fees, answering urgent questions. But his face remained controlled. That was how he survived hard days now, by holding his expression steady even when life gave him one more problem than his heart could easily bear. Tu Tien turned toward him immediately. Her eyes searched his face before she even asked a question. That had become her habit. In a life filled with unfinished trouble, she had learned that the smallest shift in his eyes often revealed more than any words he chose to speak. Jack understood the look. He gave the faintest shake of his head, a silent answer telling her that the woman was stable for now, that no new catastrophe had yet arrived, that for this one brief breath they could still stand inside uncertainty instead of loss. But then they heard it, footsteps. Not the measured pace of a nurse, not the calm approach of a doctor. These footsteps came from the far end of the corridor with the blunt force of someone already consumed by emotion before reaching the truth. They struck the floor too hard, too quickly, too unevenly. Tu Tien's spine stiffened. Jack turned his head slightly, and though his face stayed composed, something colder entered his gaze. A man appeared at the end of the hallway and came forward like a storm with skin on it. It was Nam. His face was flushed dark with rage. His breathing was broken and fast. His fists were clenched so tightly that the muscles along his forearms stood out like ropes. He did not slow down to ask the room number. He did not stop at the nurse's station. He did not ask whether his wife was conscious, injured, frightened, or even alive enough to hear his voice. He moved with the blind, brutal momentum of a man who had already decided what had happened before anyone had spoken to him. Tu Tien saw at once that reason would not be the first thing to reach him. Nam did not look like a husband arriving in fear. He looked like a man arriving in war, The grief in him had already mixed with humiliation, possessiveness, panic, and the need to strike before being struck. His body entered the hallway carrying its own accusation. Jack remained where he was. That stillness said almost as much as words could have. He did not move back, he did not move forward, he simply waited. As men sometimes do when they sense that one wrong motion will turn tension into violence. But inside him, the pressure rose sharply. He knew enough about people to understand what Nam was seeing from a distance. A stranger in expensive clothes, coming out of a hospital room where his wife lay helpless, with Tu Tien standing nearby like silent witness. The image was dangerous. The truth was simple. But images reach wounded minds much faster than truth does. Nam pushed the hospital room door open so hard that it rebounded against the wall. The sound cracked through the air and ripped the corridor's false calm in half. For one split second, everything stopped. Nam saw his wife lying weak and pale in the bed. He saw the blanket carefully pulled higher over her body. He saw the glass of water on the bedside table. He saw Jack standing there, close enough to suggest care, close enough to suggest involvement, close enough to ignite every terrible conclusion available to an injured husband who had come too late and already hated himself for it. That single image was enough. He froze only for the length of one breath, and then all the heat inside him exploded outward. Jack looked up. Their eyes met across the room, and what passed between them was not conversation. It was collision before movement. Jack saw fury, grief, suspicion, and the uncontrollable urgency of a man whose fear had found an enemy too quickly. Nam saw composure and interpreted it as arrogance. He saw gentleness and mistook it for pretense. He saw a stranger's hand near his wife's bed and thought only of threat. Then Nam lunged. He crossed the distance between them with the force of someone no longer listening to thought. His hand closed around Jack's collar and twisted it brutally upward. The fabric tightened against Jack's throat. The accusation came out through clenched teeth, jagged and breathless. "You caused the accident, didn't you? Pretending to be a good man?" The words filled the room like broken glass. Tu Tien rushed to the doorway and stopped there for a second, shocked not because she had failed to imagine danger, but because it had risen so quickly from fear into physical assault. Her heart slammed violently inside her chest. The woman in the bed stirred weakly at the noise, but not enough to fully wake. For one terrible instant, the entire room held 3 different kinds of pain at once: injury, misunderstanding, and rage. Jack did not strike back. That mattered. His body reacted, yes, but with discipline rather than retaliation. He gripped Nam's wrist, turned his shoulder, shifted his weight, and in one precise movement neutralized the force without escalating it. It was the kind of restrained self-defense that comes not from vanity but from control. He twisted Nam's arm just enough to break the attack, stepped aside, and locked him into a hold that immobilized the shoulders and wrists without throwing him to the floor. Nam fought wildly. He was no longer acting from judgment. He was acting from humiliation at being unable to protect his wife from whatever he imagined had happened. Every second of delay had been converted into fury, and now that fury needed somewhere to go. He struggled, cursed, spat accusations over his shoulder, and tried to wrench himself free. But the more violently he moved, the more obvious the contrast became between them. Nam was all impulse, noise, and collapse. Jack was steadiness under pressure, strength without cruelty, control that refused to turn into vengeance. Tu Tien stepped into the room at last. "Please stop," she said, her voice louder than fear would normally have allowed. She went first toward Nam, not because Jack needed help, but because she understood exactly what kind of fire was burning now. This was no longer about facts. It was about a husband drowning in shock, grabbing the first shape he could call guilty so he would not have to stand helpless before his wife's fragility. Tu Tien tried to speak to that part of him. She told him they had found the woman by the roadside. She told him they had brought her here. She told him no one had hurt her. But her words fell against him and slid away. He was still too deep inside panic to hear language. Jack spoke only once. "Calm down." It was not a plea. It was not a threat. It was a firm instruction delivered with the minimal force of a man who still believed this could end without disaster. But Nam took the calmness personally. To frightened men, composure can look insulting. He thrashed harder, shouted louder, and accused Jack again, as if repetition could turn fear into proof. The noise had already pulled attention from the hallway. Security came fast. Their footsteps arrived in a group, this time heavy, practical, impatient with emotional chaos. 2 men entered first, then another behind them. They took in the room instantly. The patient, the overturned chair, Tu Tien pale with tension, Nam struggling in Jack's hold, Jack restraining him without injury. The lead guard did not ask for a story first. He asked for separation. Jack released Nam the moment security took control. That release meant something too. He could have humiliated Nam in front of everyone. He could have let him fall. He could have spoken sharply, defended himself loudly, or turned the moment into proof of superiority. He did none of that. He stepped back, adjusted his collar, and remained silent. The elegance people often noticed in him was not really in his clothes or his manner. It was in that choice. Nam kept shouting. Even held by security, his anger refused to quiet immediately. He pointed at Jack. He said his wife had been harmed. He accused him of pretending. He turned once toward Tu Tien as if she might somehow be part of a hidden lie. Tu Tien felt the pressure of it all tightening around her chest. She wanted to defend Jack. She wanted to protect the unconscious woman from the violence of voices. She wanted to stop the whole scene and force the truth into everyone's hands. But hospital chaos does not pause for what good people want. The woman in the bed opened her eyes briefly, weakly, confused, enough to make the entire room hesitate. Her gaze drifted without full focus, moving from the security guards to Nam, from Nam to Tu Tien, from Tu Tien to Jack. It was not the clarity of a witness. It was only the fragile consciousness of someone pulled too suddenly back into pain. But even that brief moment changed the emotional shape of the room. Nam stopped shouting for 1 second too long. Jack looked at her but did not move closer. Tu Tien stepped to the bedside and touched her hand. In that second of suspension, everyone felt the same truth, whether they admitted it or not. The most important person in the room was the one who had not been allowed peace since they all entered it. Then the hospital made its decision. Given the assault, the accusations, the emotional instability, and the still unclear circumstances surrounding the accident, security informed them that everyone directly involved needed to go to the police station to clarify the matter. Nam, Jack, Tu Tien, and the woman once she was stable enough to be included in statements. It was not a punishment yet, it was procedure. But procedure often feels like humiliation to innocent people and like delay to the furious. The room changed then from explosive to drained. Nam was still angry, but the force of his rage had begun to leak into exhaustion. Jack stood upright, collar marked from Nam's fist, face still calm but eyes darker now. Tu Tien looked from one man to the other and felt the heaviness of what had just happened settle over her. They had rescued a stranger from the roadside. They had paid the first hospital costs. They had stayed when walking away would have been easier. And now they were being led from the hospital not as heroes, not even as simple good Samaritans, but as people tangled in suspicion and official procedure. It was the kind of bitter turn life had specialized in giving them lately. As they were guided out of the room, the contrast between the 2 men remained painfully visible. Nam walked like a man still at war with what he had seen. Jack walked like a man already carrying too many burdens to waste his dignity on anger. Tu Tien followed with quiet steps, her heart too full for tears at that moment. She was afraid, yes, But beneath the fear was something else too, a painful kind of admiration. Because even with a hand at his collar, even with accusations in his face, even with his own life already strained near breaking, Jack had still refused to become cruel. And perhaps that was the truth this night would leave behind. No matter what the police station, the statements, or the explanations would bring next, misunderstanding can enter a room faster than truth. Fear can distort gratitude into hatred in the space of one glance. Real character is revealed in the moments when a person has every excuse to retaliate and still chooses restraint. In a hospital meant for healing, all of them had arrived carrying wounds no doctor could dress properly. One woman had been injured in the body. One husband had been injured by fear. One couple had been injured by a life that kept punishing kindness with trouble. And yet even there, in that cold white room under unforgiving light, dignity still belonged most clearly to the one who had the strength to fight and chose, instead, not to harm.